So when it comes to like Catholic culture and things within that, there's a typical way that things go in terms of like the Lenten season, talks, missions, whatever the case may be, right? So I remember attending a priest seminar a long time ago, and I don't remember anything about what the main talk was all about in terms of the ongoing theme at the priest seminar, but I remember this one joke. You know, there was this guy, he was on an airplane, and basically he had a parachute, and the plan was obviously to jump out of the airplane, you know, activate the parachute, land at a particular place. But he missed his spot. So all of a sudden he found himself hanging in a tree in his parachute, and he was all in a panic. And all of a sudden he heard this rustling beneath him. And then he shouted, like, "Help, help!" And he felt the guy kind of stop. And then the guy above said, "Hey, can you tell me where I am?" And the guy below said, "You're in a tree." Guy above was like, "Oh, thanks, Father." Guy below says, "How can you tell I was a priest?" He said, "Because you said something that was true. That was totally useless." I know I should hate that joke because I'm a priest, but I love it. Because people tend to forget that before we became priests, we were people too. So I remember sitting in those pews and just kind of like you're waiting for something. Like people have this intuition that, you know, Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and life, and religion is about things of ultimate concern, and yet how is it that Catholic culture and the things we do within Catholic culture can be so incredibly boring, right? And you see this all the time. And that's why people kind of fall into this sense of like empty practice and routine, very much like the scribes and the Pharisees, right? So the invitation is to go deeper, obviously, to be more real, to be more authentic. And the analogy that comes to mind, one of our recurring events at our parish is Theology on Tap. Has anyone been to Theology on Tap before, even like locally? I'm sure you, okay. So Theology on Tap, basically what it is, it's what it sounds like, right? So someone or some people give a talk about theology at some local bar. So basically the first goal is to kind of reach people where they're at. So recognizing there's a certain intimidation factor to go to like perhaps a worship setting. Is there another way we can evangelize the culture by meeting people where they're at in a space which is actually kind of comfortable? Fine, right? But also Theology on Tap is meant to kind of lend itself to a more free-flowing dialogue where we can just kind of hang out. Now it's interesting, if you've ever been to Theology on Tap, people do it in different ways. So sometimes people don't quite get the second part, whereas what it's supposed to be is very relaxed and organic and natural, because that's the way the gospel is meant to be made manifest. The analogy that comes to mind, I was talking to my spiritual director a while back, and I remember asking him, "What's your working image of priesthood?" And I wouldn't ask anyone this, but he's a very thoughtful and holy guy. And what he said was like, "You know, Eric, my working image of priesthood is I'm just puttering around the garden. I'm just puttering around the garden. I can't make the plant grow. So my job is to till the soil, water the plant, make sure the plant faces the sun, and then wait and monitor the plant, make sure things are okay." Again, I can't make the plant grow, but I do these things because sometimes the Lord needs people to till the soil. Depending on how you receive the image, it can be discouraging or encouraging, right? I tend to think it's kind of encouraging because it gives a sense of how we're supposed to work in collaboration with God's grace. It's kind of a weird thing, right? Like, I found more and more as I progressed in ministry and the priesthood, it's like, the more you intentionally do less, the more effective the thing actually is. It's a variation of like the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, right? A key prerequisite to that particular miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, is I provide the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. No more, no less. Now the temptation is to think, well gosh, because the stakes are high, because the pressure is on, maybe there's a certain kind of time pressure. Therefore, I need to be more or do more than the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. But it's especially true in those moments of crisis that you focus on being small so the Lord can be large, if you will. You find a similar thing when it comes to the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. Like, you know how there's the water and the wine, and so the wine represents the Lord, and like, you know, the drop of water represents our humanity. I always frame it to people like, okay, your job in life, in ministry, is to be the single drop of water. Not even 2 drops, the single drop of water. You see that up and down the gospel. So Mary, like, my soul magnifies the Lord. St. Paul, right, the thorn in the flesh. I have this dangling sense of insecurity. Lord, Lord, please, please take it away. Right? And the Lord doesn't. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And St. Paul has to recognize that I need to learn to not just tolerate the thorn in the flesh, but embrace it and love it, because through that, I bestow grace to the holy people of God. That's a long and complicated way to say that don't be afraid of just kind of being ordinary and natural and just live life in a very natural and organic sort of way. Because when you think about it, when it comes to like planning and structure and that sort of thing, there's something to that. But if you think about it, a lot of times the reason why we kind of delve heavily into that particular aspect of life is because we're afraid. And the fact that I have the capacity to organize things or have plans and structure and that sort of thing, it's not really because God calls me to that. It's because deep down I'm kind of afraid. And a sense of busyness and psychological noise makes me feel secure. But I don't know about you, I always think about this, right? Like, something that constantly haunts my dreams. I don't want to look back and think about what my life could have been if I wasn't afraid. I don't mean taking unnecessary risks, I mean this thing we're talking about here. Like, what if I took away all these things, which are not evil things, but unnecessary things, which I do or pursue because it makes me feel safe, because in reality I'm scared. What if I let go of like this, that, and the other thing? And when you pray into it, you think about it for a moment, you realize the Lord's calling you to let go of all these different things, discover that He is enough, and He's always been enough. The example that comes to mind, you ever seen that movie, The Wild Robot? Has anyone seen it? I was driving home to the church from an off-site appointment, and all of a sudden there was gridlock, and I thought, well, do I want to be stuck in traffic, or do I want to hang out in the mall? Gimme, right? And so I went to this mall, Scarborough Town Center, and they had a movie theater. And basically it was just like, what was playing at this time. And I saw, like it was between like this movie and like Wild Robot, and I'm like, I don't want to see Wild Robot, that's kind of like stupid or something. And then I felt like, okay, my hand's being forced. I watched this thing, it was like amazing. And I thought so much of it that I made this video, and you can find it on Catholic Latte. It's my highest performing video. So I believe on Facebook it's garnered like 420,000 views. And what's funny is that basically that particular video is a live recording of a homily that I did on the Wild Robot. And it was basically one of these things where I showed how the overall narrative reflects Jesus' public ministry, so you can watch it later on. Anyways, the whole thing was that I gave that obviously on the Saturday and the Sunday. Obviously, I'm pitching this movie hard, like even this homily. And some of the sacristans, they heard this, and so then they watched the movie on Sunday afternoon. And then on Monday, they came to me and they're like, hey, we saw the movie. And I was like, hey, what'd you like? What'd you think, right? And we're all recalling our favorite parts of the movie. And then it occurred to me that in the homily that I gave to the parish, I never mentioned any of the things I actually love about the movie. Kind of interesting thing. It's interesting you can put a lot of work into a thing and, okay, there's structure and there's a sense of like, the different points and you elaborate it and you do your research and thought process, whatever. But it lacks heart and it lacks passion. And therefore it's not real. So if you watch Catholic Latte, basically I filmed another video, and that was actually a social experiment. So I thought, you know what, I'm gonna film myself in the studio and just like, not even worry about if people like it or if they learn anything from it. The whole point of this video, I'm just gonna talk about why I love this movie. And if it doesn't work, I might not even post it. And so I just did it. And it was just like, press play, record, and it wasn't even like 3 scenes, it was like 2 scenes. And if you watch that thing, I'm like ugly crying, there's like snot everywhere and stuff, right? But it was very much on point, and I thought, no, that's something I had to remember forever. And again, it's not about the movie, it's not about expounding upon the thing on an exegetical level. It's like having the courage to go to that space where you can be real and honest and true, and trusting that's not just good enough, that's exactly what the Lord wants you to do to be an effective conduit of grace. In my second parish, basically, I did a lot of funerals. I always say this, I don't know if it's true, but I've always found this for myself. There tends to be kind of an unspoken rule in parishes. If there's like 2 priests, and one's the pastor and one's the associate pastor, the associate pastor tends to do most of the weddings, and the pastor tends to do all the funerals. I don't know if it's true here, but it was definitely true in my previous settings when I was with another priest. But at St. Leonard's, it wasn't the case. And I remember in my first parish, when I first got ordained and stuff, okay, funerals were kind of scary, because like death in the air, and people are in mourning and stuff, and like you want to do justice to the thing. You don't want to make a mistake. Because what if I make a mistake and this person's in crisis? How awful would that be, right? And so I remember I would always give a homily based on, it was always the same homily. It was like word for word, here's this little thing, and I'll give the same homily every single time or whatever. And then when it came to my second parish in St. Leonard's, I don't know, for some reason just stopped doing that. And so I started to kind of wing it. And the whole time, my reference point, I remember going to the graduation ceremony for my brother, actually. He was in one of these IT programs. But his school was like multidisciplinary. And so what happened was, I believe the keynote speech at the graduation ceremony was given by someone who graduated from a nursing program. And she was a single mom. And I don't remember the specific content of her speech, I just remember her speech, how she gave it. And it was interesting. You could tell that she wasn't used to giving speeches. You could tell she hadn't been to Toastmasters or whatever. She was making a lot of technical errors, like ums and ahs and breaks here and there, and her structure wasn't terrific. But you could tell that I'm just going to be real and honest and true, and it was spellbinding. I couldn't take my eyes off of her. And it's something I remembered all the time. And you see this in funerals, like never mind like the priest giving the homily. If you've ever been to a funeral and you hear the eulogy, the person could be talking about, just on the face of it, the most ridiculous stuff. But if they're real and honest and true, it is spellbinding and captivating and intoxicating because we so rarely see people live and act and choose from that space. As you know, a lot of times there's like the funeral mass that's preceded by the visitation at the funeral home. And so I gave the prayers and I gave a short reflection. And this guy came up to me, and he was a young man. And he was like, I was thinking about how I'm giving the eulogy tomorrow. And the guy who died, he's my best friend and stuff. And I'm looking at this thing I wrote, and I guess I could give it, but you know what? Anyone could give this thing. I'm supposed to be his best friend. So I feel like I should just go and just be brave and just speak from the heart. And I just met this guy, and I'm like, yeah, you should. The way the eulogy went, basically he broke it down. What he was saying was that my best friend is a racist and a womanizer. Because I think what happened was like, the one guy who's deceased, he was Italian, and this other guy was Portuguese. And also like they were chasing girls and stuff, right? So that was basically the eulogy. And I remember sitting there thinking like, I would never give a eulogy like this, right? But it's true to him, and it's true to their relationship. And so that's why it works. And to this day, I gotta say honestly, that's the best eulogy I've ever heard in my entire life, right? This is a long kind of preface to kind of get at a proper notion of Christian anthropology. So who are we? How does God see us? How does God call us to grow and change and transform? And that's why, it's a variation of like making sure you're accurate with regards to the starting point. Because if your sense of the human person and the Lord and the way that God's grace works is like off, your approach to ministry and evangelization, even your own personal growth, is going to be kind of off. I find sometimes watching videos on YouTube can be helpful. Not all the time. Sometimes it's a waste of time. But sometimes it's helpful for Lenten missions. And so, I don't know if you know anything about comic books. Okay, so there's Superman and there's Batman, right? So Batman has a rogues gallery of different villains, right? And one of them is Poison Ivy. And Poison Ivy, her secret power is that she kisses men and hypnotizes them, and they become evil. Anyways, it had to be there. So there's a comic called Batman Hush, and it was turned into an animated film. And so basically what happens is that Poison Ivy kisses Superman, and he starts to do evil and nefarious things. And Batman, he's trying to break him out of it. And so he has a multi-tiered plan. So initially he tries to reason with him. That doesn't work, he's almost killed. And then as a final resort, he gestures to Catwoman, and Catwoman is up on the top of a building, and she has Lois Lane, who obviously is Superman's love interest. And so he gives her the signal, and Catwoman pushes Lois Lane off the building. And it creates this crisis within Superman's heart. What's going to win out, like the good or the evil? And of course, because he's Superman, the good wins out, snaps out of it, goes and saves Lois Lane. Goes back to Batman. He's like, hey, thanks a lot, but that could have gone really bad, right? And so it harkens back to this conversation that Batman had with Catwoman, where Batman explains the plan. This is what we're going to do as a last resort. And Catwoman says, how do you know that's going to work? And Batman says, it's going to work because deep down, Superman is good. And deep down, I'm not. I'm like, wow. It's pretty profound for a comic book. It goes to this notion of what we might call like the working image that you have with regards to key theological concepts. How do I see myself? How do I see myself? Do I believe that fundamentally speaking, I am good? I struggle with human weakness, I struggle with concupiscence and desire, inclination towards sin, right? But at the same time, do I believe that I'm a child of God, created by the one who is love, and therefore I am fundamentally good? Or do I believe that I'm evil and wicked and bad? Now, you might say, well, obviously, I believe in the former. I think if you were to ask people in terms of a catechetical inquiry, what do you believe? You know kind of the answer is, I'm good, I'm created by God, whatever, right? But in terms of how people actually live their lives, I think people actually believe that they're evil and wicked and bad. And you know that because of how people live their lives. I remember my spiritual director was talking about this with regards to seminarians, guys studying for the holy priesthood. So what he'll say is that, okay, a lot of times what you'll find is that guys who enter to the seminary, what happens is they live a life of sin and debauchery or whatever. They have a conversion experience. They discover the Lord. They immerse themselves in the sacraments, confession, Eucharist, habit of prayer. They discern a possible vocation to the holy priesthood. They enter the seminary. Seminary is long. I was in seminary for like 6 years. And then what happens, this comes for everyone, right? What happens is at a certain point, you feel like the Lord is inviting you to let go of certain things, to receive something which is new. It's an interesting thing. Sometimes there's a building upon of that which came before, the natural kind of accumulation of knowledge and learning from tradition and kind of growing through that particular dynamic. But sometimes it's like the old and new wineskins thing, right? You remember that gospel? Where it's just like sometimes what you gotta do is to fully receive that which is new, I need to let go of that which is old. And the thing which is old, part of the reason why it's hard to let it go is because it kind of works. It might not even be like a sinful habit. It might even be like a false simile for something you actually desire. It could be something like, I live in a spiritual concentration camp. And I think that's the thing which keeps me safe. And that's the thing which keeps me close to God. And that's the thing which keeps me from the darkness. As a result of which I live in constant tension and fear. And sometimes what happens is like we're living so habitually in that space, we don't know any other way. Like based on our own experience, but also because, well shoot, everyone else is doing that too. Everyone else is living in a spiritual concentration camp, so I don't know what it looks like to be authentic, to be real, to be living the freedom which is meant for the holy people of God. I remember attending a retreat where a priest was talking about this, and he said, you know, I know there's an enduring value to having, for example, an examination of conscience, where I look at a particular prompt to remind me of the possible things I've done and failed to do with regards to the moral life, to be better, especially as I prepare myself for the sacrament confession. But he said, that said, what I often find is that people are often provoked to be better, to be holy, when they're shown the best of humanity as opposed to the worst of humanity, especially as it pertains to themselves. So this is kind of a foundational thing you find in the gospel. When it comes to like the mission of the church, what is the mission of the church? Most people respond with anecdotal evidence or like mere opinion. I think it's this, or I heard it was that. But there actually is an actual answer to that particular question. It's found in the Gospel of Matthew near the end. Jesus Christ comes back from the dead and he gives what's called the Great Commission. Go forth and make disciples of all nations, teaching them everything I commanded you, and baptizing them. Now, before I was a priest, I was a lawyer. And before I was a lawyer, I was an English major. So this is kind of interesting to me because it involves English grammar. You might find it colossally boring, but don't worry, it's almost over. Right? So as you know, a verb is an action word. If there's more than one verb in a sentence, one of the verbs is the finite verb, the grammatical hinge of the sentence, the main verb around which the entire sentence revolves. Other verbs that they exist are called participles. And participles modify the overall meaning of the sentence, but they only make sense in light of the finite verb. The reason why that's important is because when you look at the wording of the Great Commission, there's 4 verbs. Go, make, baptize, and teach. One of them is the finite verb. the main verb, the grammatical hinge of the sentence. The rest are participles. The reason why that's important, once you identify the finite verb, you know the mission of the Holy Catholic Church. Okay, so this is a brief moment of participation. Show of hands. I'm not going to call on you. I just want to see a show of hands, okay? So, the question is, which of those four verbs is the main verb? Go, make, baptize, and teach. Who says go? Who says make? Who says baptize? Who says teach? Who's not voting? Everybody. Okay. It's the first time. I understand. Go, make, baptize, and teach. We'll try it again. Who thinks it's go? Make, baptize, teach. Okay. So most people guess baptize and teach, which makes sense, right? And why? Because you can have the most beautiful mission statement written down, but our values are demonstrated by what we do. And what we do as a parish community, we tend to baptize, we tend to teach. Sacramental prep, conveying information, baptizing, sacramentalizing. We're really good at that, right? The answer actually is make. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Bunch of liars, right? So the mission of the Holy Catholic Church is to make disciples of all nations, in service of which is the going and the baptizing and the teaching, which in turn begs the question, what does it mean to be a disciple? We're used to the terminology of being a student, right? So the goal of being a student is to know what the teacher knows. Insofar as I know what the teacher knows, I'm a good student. If I know it perfectly, I'm a great student, right? Discipleship, though, is different. The goal is to become the teacher, to become the rabbi. Now, in terms of like Old Testament background, right, there were different levels of Bible education, right? So what would happen is, in the very beginning, first level, Jewish boys and girls would go to Bible school, and they would try to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible. This is before the New Testament, but still, you know. Vast majority of kids would be sent home. They'd be told one of two things. Go learn to manage your household, or go learn to apply your family trade. Your father's a fisherman, do that. Your father's a carpenter, do that. Go home to learn to apply your family trade. The best, though, will go on to stage 2. Stage 2 is I memorize the entirety of the Hebrew Scriptures. Again, before the New Testament, but still impressive. Genesis through Malachi, memorized, word for word. Okay, still, vast majority of kids sent home. Go home, learn to apply your family trade. The intellectual elite will go on to stage 3. There's no more Bible to be memorized, right? So what these guys would do, they would go to different rabbis throughout the countryside, different schools of thought, and they would pose a question. Rabbi so-and-so, will you take me on as your disciple? And obviously the question is, do you believe that I can do what you do? Do you believe that I can become you? As opposed to simply, do you believe that I'm smart? If he thinks no, the rabbi will say, go home, learn to apply your family trade. If he thinks yes, what he'll say is, come, follow me. And you're like, huh, I've never heard that before, right? You find that when it comes to the calling of the disciples. Now here's the thing, when it comes to the calling of the disciples, what are these guys doing? They're fishing, they're tax collecting, they're applying the family trade, which means they're not the smartest, they're not the brightest, they don't have cultural recognition. People have given up on them a long time ago. And here's the Lord, and he comes to them. Come follow me. I see something in you that perhaps you do not see in yourself. And so even though you don't see it, the invitation to trust in me and trust in my promise, and let's do this thing. Let's go on this great adventure to possibly become another Christ in this world. Now you pause that and you look at like different episodes in the gospel where that happens, right? So, obviously a lot of times when you think about that, you think about like, Peter and James and Andrew and stuff. But like think about Matthew. So Matthew, Levi, right? This is portrayed in that really famous painting by Caravaggio. But you see Matthew, and he's not just a tax collector, a traitor to the Jewish people by collecting exorbitant taxes on behalf of the occupying Roman Empire. He's like in the process of tax collecting, right? So the reason why the holy people of God hate my guts, I'm not just this person, I'm doing the thing for which they hate me. So I'm counting my money, the spoils of my collections, right? And here's Jesus Christ, and he's at the door, right? This is in this painting. And what happens is, it's a weird situation in a certain sense. He's pointing at St. Matthew, but his feet are pointing out the door. And the position of his hand and finger is the same position as what you find with Adam and God the Father in the Sistine Chapel. You remember where they're kind of reclining like this? Now, the thing about that, people think of it in terms of like, oh, Adam's just asleep. Adam is dead. Adam is dead in that painting. And so here's God, he busts into his life, and if our fingers touch, you are imbued with my divine life. And with that, a certain dynamism, a certain propelling forth on mission. Again, that's the same hand position that Jesus has when he points at St. Matthew. But at the same time, the feet going out the door. So I call you now. I know you're a tax collector. You're doing that right now, right? And whether you respond, I'm leaving. And so the immediacy of the invitation, but also couched with like, come follow me. Like, I believe in you, trust in me, trust in my promise. You notice actually when it comes to the gospel rendering of that particular scene, I didn't notice this till this year. The moment that Matthew accepts the invitation to follow the Lord in a stance of discipleship, he spontaneously throws a party. I don't know if you noticed that before. I didn't notice that again until this year. He throws a party and invites all his tax collector buddies. Right? Like, I'm so blown away by the fact that this guy notices me and believes in me and hopes in me that I want other people to share in that love and acceptance and hope. You find a similar thing when it comes to this parallel story. Like, there's the rich young man, that story, and then there's a story of Zacchaeus. They're meant to be, again, read in parallel. The rich young man goes up to Christ, and he's like, man, I'm not happy. You find out later on he's followed all the commandments since his youth, right? So the rich young man stands in the place of all those guys who are like, look, you know, I go to Mass, I say my prayers, I pray the rosary, I call my mom, I do good things, I don't do evil and wicked things. But I'm not happy. I feel a certain restlessness in my heart, right? The Lord's answer is twofold. So first of all, follow the commandments, avoid egregious violations of love because you're created in the image and likeness of God, who is love. So if you violate that in significant ways, you can't be happy. So there's that. But secondly, he looks at him, and again, like, just to simplify it, what he says to him is like, look, the reason why you're not happy is because you and I are not friends. That's the reason why you're not happy. And he's shocked. How can that be the answer? How can it not be? Somehow I fooled myself into thinking that the key to eternal life is being good, saying prayers, doing liturgical things. As you know, there's a way to live the Christian faith in such a way where God is just beyond the scope of my heart. We're not really in relationship, we're not really friends. So I might be saying prayers and going to Catholic things and trying to be good, right? But if Christ and I are not really friends, then I will always feel a certain restlessness. And so the rich young man, like, he just can't do it, right? I can't like do the wineskin thing, right? Being rich and young and being good, this is kind of like worked for me, kind of, and so I got to let this go in favor of that which is new. And so, I don't know, on some level he settles and he goes away sad. And Pope Francis, he really nails this. He's like, that's why the rich young man is forever known and remembered as the man who used to be young and used to be rich. Now you pause that and you think about the guy Zacchaeus, right? This is kind of a funny story. Zacchaeus is a tax collector, so hated, chief tax collector, so like really hated, and to rub it in, the gospel says, oh, and by the way, he was short, right? And so what you hear is that Jesus Christ is passing by. Zacchaeus, he wants to see Jesus. I don't know what I'm looking for, but I have the sense that my deep desires and the realization of these desires are caught up in the person of Christ. So I'm short, okay, I'm going to climb this sycamore tree. And obviously that highlights the fact that he's short. And here's Jesus Christ, and what does Christ say to him? Zacchaeus, I must be with you today. Shades of Matthew. I know you're a tax collector. I know you're a chief tax collector. But I call you now. Of all the people I could be with, I want to be with you right now, even though, like all of us, you're a person in the process of becoming. And again, you see, he's struck by it. So you're meant to compare that to the response of the rich young man. I can't do that because I'm young, because I'm rich, because I have patterns and a certain concentration camp mentality which just kept me safe and kind of worked. Here's the chaos, and it's like, you know what? There's something about you which provokes something in my heart that I will freely, without instruction, let everything go in the pursuit of the one who satisfies this thing in my heart. And that's what he says. Look, I'm gonna divest myself of like half myself and give it to the poor. If I defraud anyone of anything, I'll pay them back 4 times as much. And he goes on this great adventure. It's an amazing, beautiful thing. I always think about St. Peter. In a certain sense, he's my favorite saint, because he's a constant screw-up. You remember how, basically, when it comes to the calling of St. Peter, it begins with him fishing all night and catching nothing and washing his nets? This might sound kind of sexist. I don't mean it to be. Guys tend to kind of ground our sense of identity and my ability to produce that which the world finds to be important and valuable. I know we're all guilty of that, but guys especially so. Who am I but the sum of my functionalities and efficiencies and productivities? We're massively guilty about that. So here's this guy, right, St. Peter, he's a fisherman. And so it's not just like I'm not productive. I'm not productive with regards to my thing. So you would think, okay, before it's like, hey, fisherman, more fish, more man. If I catch a lot of fish, like it's a good day, I'm awesome. If I catch a little bit of fish, I feel like less of a man. If I catch no fish, oh boy, I'm pathetic, right? So he begins the story heavily steeped in shame and self-loathing. All I want to do is go home and like lick my wounds, drink a beer, I don't know, like whatever, right? He begins the story like that. And then Jesus Christ busts into his life then. And what happens is Jesus is surrounded by all these people. They want to listen to him and whatever. And so Jesus' plan is like, I'm going to get into a boat, I'm going to push away from the shore to create better sight lines, because these people, they are crushing me. Right? So I get in this boat, I push away, I can better see them, they can better see me. Okay, fine. And what he does, he gets into St. Peter's boat without permission. It's important to kind of catch these details, right? I like to do this example with the kids in the schools because it really kind of throws them for a loop. So like, okay, boys and girls, so imagine you're St. Peter, you fished all night and caught nothing, you want to go home and drink beer. And all of a sudden, Jesus Christ gets in your boat without permission. How do you feel? And they're like, honored. And I'm like, you are not paying attention. And he wants to tell Jesus, drop dead, right? But he doesn't. And why? And the kids will say, oh, because he's Jesus. No. Because of the crowd. The crowd thinks that Jesus Christ is amazing. So it's like, oh, Rabbi, of course, yeah, you can use my boat. So then he gets in his boat, pushes away from the shore. Now here's the thing, you don't find this in the gospel. Does Jesus Christ give a short sermon or a long sermon? Again, I'll ask the kids, what do you think, kids? And they'll say, like, long sermon. Why? Because he's Jesus. I think he gives a long sermon, but not because he's Jesus, but because he wants to get the crowd their money's worth. They come from far and wide, right? So it's like going to a Taylor Swift concert. She sings one song. It's like, what? So I think he gives a long sermon. Okay. I don't know if you've ever been through a long sermon before, right? But it can be painful. And so at the end of it, Peter's like, before I wanted to kill myself, now I'm going to kill you. Surely Jesus Christ will let me go now. But then Jesus says, hey, let's go fishing. And Peter's like, oh my gosh. And then what happens is that he catches so much fish, of course the nets are beginning to burst. Enlists help of the other guys, they bring him to the shore. Depart from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man. What if it's the same story, except there is no Jesus and there is no crowd? And so here's Peter, and he's fishing, and he catches this huge amount of fish, bursting at the seams, more fish than he's ever caught in his entire life. What would Peter have done in that particular circumstance? Sometimes the kids will say, hey, he would give it to the poor. No. He would eat some, sell the rest of it, make a ton of money, and go home, kick up his feet, and say, wow, I'm awesome. I'm so good. Look how much fish I caught today. More fish, more man. But now he walks away from more fish than he's ever caught in his entire life. And it's all the more impressive because he's a fisherman. My thing is fish, and I walk away from it to follow Christ. Doesn't that just blow your mind? And the question is, how? It's interesting, it's not because of something he read in the book. It's not like he read this book about discipleship and spiritual detachment, and okay, I'm more than the sum of my fish, right? What happened was that he began the story heavily steeped in shame and weakness and fatigue. Jesus Christ busts into his life. All those things, they don't go away, they intensify. I'm upset, I'm enraged, I'm actually kind of angry at Jesus. But throughout all that stuff, God is slowly working on his heart to prepare him for that which is to come. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, The Karate Kid. I know there's two, right? So there's one with Jackie Chan. We'll pretend it doesn't exist. The real one is from the 80s, right? Ralph Macchio and Pat Morita. And so you remember that whole thing where like there's the kid, Daniel-san, and he's being beaten up in the school, and he goes to the master and okay, I want to learn karate so I can defend myself. And he goes, and you remember what happens? Mr. Miyagi just has him do these household chores. Sand the floor, paint the fence, the very famous wax on, wax off. And the whole time he's thinking like, when am I going to start learning karate? But the answer was, well, you've always been learning karate. It just comes to you through your ordinary life. And this is the thing. The Lord knows that we have all sorts of barriers and hang-ups and all sorts of ways to interfere with the reception of his grace, but you don't need to worry about anything within your heart in terms of constituting a permanent barrier to God's grace. God can bust through anything. He passes through locked doors. You remember that, like post-resurrection. And what's more, your heart is meant to receive the gifts. It's a weird thing. You don't even need to know exactly what your barriers are. The Lord is slowly working through these things, right? But I guess the reason why I bring up the example involving St. Peter is just to highlight this thing, right? A lot of times we have a certain expectation for what the Catholic life is supposed to be. Even if you have this notion that the mission of the church is discipleship and the becoming of Christ in this world, you have the sense that, okay, it's very neat and categorized and predictable. I read this book, I attend this thing, I acquire this virtue. It becomes a virtue through repetition and practice, and then I grow in a way which is comprehensible and cohesive. A little bit of that. But a lot of times what happens is I go through life and life is brutal and life is confusing, and I go through my daily life and the Lord provokes these things within my heart to reveal these areas which are in need of healing and growth, that were always in need of healing and growth, but needed difficult and challenging circumstances to be brought to light, never mind actually achieve healing, incrementally speaking. And I say that to you because that's a really good thing to remember at the beginning of Lent. Sometimes we have this crazy thing that the whole point of Lent is to just keep up arbitrary penitential practices. You wake up on Ash Wednesday, and it's like, oh right, Ash Wednesday, Lent, and like prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. So I guess I'll say a couple of prayers, I'll deny myself chocolate cake, and like give to my favorite charity. And it's like, I guess, right? But if you recognize the goal is to look more like Christ at the end of the 40 days, and that primarily it's God's project as opposed to your own, okay, there's a sense of like, I do certain things to demonstrate goodwill, to demonstrate a certain openness to God's grace, but then, okay, Lord, what are you going to do to work on my heart over the course of the 40 days and be prepared for an ordeal? But if you keep in mind these different stories that we're talking about here, when you encounter these moments and you feel the shame and the vulnerability and the sense of being off kilter and off balance, you won't think, well, gosh, somehow I'm beyond the scope of God's grace or God has abandoned me. Like, no, I'm walking the path of people like St. Peter. This is what's required for me to change, to become more like Christ, to become great. One final thought, I'll kind of end with this. I remember there was a friend of mine actually a while back, he was sharing with me his vocation story. And basically what he said was that it was him and another girl, and he liked this girl, and they were listening to a testimony by a bishop. And basically the bishop was saying, he was saying this in kind of dramatic terms, but you'll see the point. He said, you know, many people are called by the Lord to pursue greatness, particular vocations, but like greatness, right? But many people, they fail to respond to the call for a variety of reasons. Fear, a sense of one's insufficiency, a sense of like, not now, but later, which is code for like, no, you know. People do that all the time. But what he said was that if everyone does that, Holy Mother Church will die. And my friend, he said, you know, I heard that, This girl that I loved, she heard that. And we were so moved and so provoked in our hearts that I became a priest and she became a nun, right? You can look at the culture and you can look at like what's happening, what's not happening, stats and whatever, and there can be this vibe of like, gosh, it seems to be that the church is a sinking ship and a losing team, and I don't want to be part of a sinking ship or a losing team, right? But you gotta remember how the Lord actually has worked throughout the course of human history. Whenever there's been a crisis in the world, the Lord calls people to be great and to be saints and to respond to this particular age. Father Fabian and I were just talking about this actually just before the thing kind of began. There's always a temptation to kind of reduce talks like this to like, okay, we should do this, 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 and these are the enduring things which kind of hold true through the ages. There's something to be said about enduring principles, but the great adventure when it comes to the apostolic life is that this is your time. And so the solution is never like, hey, here's my program or here's my solution, right? It falls upon the mystical body of Christ. This is our problem, so what is our solution? And the idea is that, okay, mindful of the fact that I'm a unique person within the mystical body of Christ, and this particular age contains unique problems and challenges. What can I do, and what can we do, collectively and individually, to move the thing along, even incrementally speaking? And just to get a whiff of that sense of like call and adventure and challenge, again, it could go either way. And a lot of people, they just fall away from that, but I guess I want to hopefully inspire you to have this inclination to step forward as opposed to stepping back. It's not simply a matter of the Lord calling the few to convey graces to the many. He calls every single one of you to be great, and all that's contained in that particular exhortation. Come follow me.